Shalom, and welcome to V'ahavta Yisrael, a Hebrew phrase which means you shall love Israel. We hope you'll stay with us for the next 30 minutes as our teacher, Dr. Baruch, shares his expository teaching from the Bible. Dr. Baruch is the senior lecturer at the Zera Avraham Institute based in Israel. Although all courses are taught in Hebrew at the Institute, Dr. Baruch is pleased to share this weekly address in English. To find out more about our work in Israel, please visit us on the web at LoveIsrael.org. That's one word, LoveIsrael.org. Now, here's Baruch with today's lesson.
Paul knew what it was to have his faith tested, to see those that he considered his countrymen, brothers in faith in God, and to see them turn against him and do so in a way that was not walking in uprightness and in truth. You know, we may disagree with each other, but that disagreement, because we think we're right, that does not give us the authority to say things and to do things outside the character of God. And that's what we see as a small group of leaders, influential people in Jerusalem. They were moving against Paul, and they continued to, even though time and time God had delivered Paul out of their hands. And we're going to see another example of that tonight. So with that said, take out your Bible and look with me to the book of Acts and chapter 25. The book of Acts and chapter 25. Now, we're going to see that the leader for Rome in this story, in this account from God's inerrant word, is a man named Festus. And he is not a godly man. He is not a believer. And therefore, he does not, for the most part, rule with integrity. But he does, in the end, do what's incumbent upon him to do. But if he could have turned things in order to find a good outcome from him through evilness, and this is the problem. Many people think that good can come from evil. Well, let me tell you, when you practice evil, don't expect good. Expect what we spoke about in Psalm 11 at the end. That God is going to move, that he is going to be hot and angry at those who do not submit, who kind of just doubt God's sovereignty, doubt God's ability to set things in order. And I'm glad that the Apostle Paul was someone who did indeed trust God and knew God was watching, that God had perfect discernment, and therefore he made his decisions based upon the revelation of God's word. That God is faithful, that God is watching, that God is able, and therefore Paul submitted to what was right because he knew that the Lord, he is righteous. Well, again, look with me, if you would, to Acts 25 and verse 1. Notice what we see here. Therefore, Festus, he came into the province, and after 3 days, he went up into Jerusalem from Caesarea. Now, we need to remember that Caesarea is kind of the Roman capital within Israel, in that part of the Middle East. So he traveled, and he came into Israel, and he stopped at this Roman port city called Caesarea. And he rested there for a few days, and after he left Caesarea, notice what it says. He went up into Jerusalem. And what happened? Verse 2. We read that the high priest and this next phrase is in the plural in the Masoretic text. It says the chief ones or the first ones of the Judeans. What did they do? They manifested against him, that is, against Paul. And what did they want to do? Well, they manifested against him we'll see in a moment, charges, accusations that Paul had transgressed in many ways. So they manifested against him. Who was that? The high priest and the leaders of the Judeans against Paul, and they were seeking him. Now, these individuals that are spoken of in this first verse, they should be understood as kind of leaders of the government, the Jewish government that was subjected to the Roman Empire. They had a degree of authority, but it was limited. Now, here's something, and this shows God's providence. Why do I say that? Because Paul, as we've already seen, he is a Roman citizen. And because of that citizenship, he has benefits that other Jews did not have before the Roman Empire. And that meant that if he was not a Roman citizen, then the Jewish leadership could have chosen to judge him and done whatever they wanted to do. And Rome would not have interfered. They could have killed him just like they did Stephen earlier on in chapter 7 of the book of Acts. But because Paul was a Roman citizen, as we can see in a few minutes, he could demand a Roman trial, to have a Roman official hear and judge his case. And providentially, we see that Festus came into Israel. He was at Caesarea. And after 3 days, and remember something, 3 is for the purpose of revealing something, and much is going to be revealed in this text. So it says, and after 3 days, he went up into Jerusalem from Caesarea, where immediately the high priests and the leaders of the Judeans, what did they do? They manifested, and the implication is they manifested these accusations, these charges, this indictment against Paul, wanting that he would agree to turn Paul over to them. Look now, if you would, to verse 3. And asking a favor from them. And what was that? Well, asking a favor, literally asking a favor against him. So these leaders, they were seeking a favor. Now, what does that imply? It implied that the merit of their case or the legitimacy of their requests was not proper. So instead of saying, do what is proper, they said, do us a favor. Work with us in regard to this. And what did they want? Well, let me translate it correctly. Look again at verse 3. And asking a favor against him, so that, and what was that? That he should send him into Jerusalem. Now, what do we remember? We need to remember that Paul left Jerusalem. He was taken there by night under a guard, under soldiers, that he would be kept in Caesarea. And now, what are they doing? A new leader has come into the situation, and therefore they are asking a favor. They are requesting that Paul be sent back to Jerusalem. Why was that? Hoping that he, as a Jewish prisoner, despite the fact that he's a Roman citizen, would be put under their watchmanship. And therefore, they could do what they have already desired to do, and that is to kill him in shedding innocent blood, meaning this, to do so in a way contrary to the Torah. So even if a person's guilty, and Paul, of course, is not, we'll talk about that in a moment, but even if a person's guilty of something, but yet he is punished in an improper way or put to death without a proper trial, according to the right interpretation of Jewish law, that is shedding innocent blood. And they didn't care. We've seen already that there's been plots and conspiracies to lay in wait for Paul and put him to death as he's being transferred. So look again at verse 3. They were asking a favor against him, that is, against Paul, so that he would send him into Jerusalem. For what purpose? Well, this is why they were asking. In order that they might make an ambush to kill him on the way. Now, I would underline that last phrase in verse 3, at least it appears last in the Greek text, kata tin hodon, which means on the way. That word way is a very important word. And something is being communicated in this text. That they wanted to kill Paul because he was walking in the way. Now, if you're a good student of the scripture, you know that one of the ways that early believers were called, they were called by that terminology, servants, those who walked according to the way. They were the people of the way. And this is very important because what the scripture's telling us in a very clear way is that they wanted to kill Paul because he was walking in the way of the Lord Messiah, Yeshua. This is why they were wanting to lay an ambush for him. Now, this term here that we see for an ambush, it implies something that does not have integrity, that is not being carried out by a judicial branch. The Sanhedrin, it's not a trial there. It's not a trial before Rome. No, they are taking matters into their own hands. Why? Well, the most reasonable explanation is this. They know they cannot win in a trial. Not before the Sanhedrin and also not before the Roman authority. So they want again that he would be transferred because they've tried twice and their plans were thwarted. And now they're going to try a third time to kill him upon the way. Look now to verse 4. Therefore, Festus, he answered to keep Paul in Caesarea. Now, Festus, he wanted favor. He wanted to benefit from this. He wanted to use this situation for his benefit. And he says, nevertheless, that Paul has to be kept in Caesarea. Now, we know that others of the Roman Empire understood what was going on, that they wanted to kill Paul upon the journey as he's being transferred. There was a plot earlier on in Jerusalem as they were moving him from one place before the Sanhedrin, and there was another attempt. And this is why the leader put so many soldiers around Paul as they sent him to Caesarea. Certainly Festus would have been brief on all of this information. He would have known it. And therefore, what did he do? He kept Paul in Caesarea. And he himself, we read in the middle of verse 4, but he himself was about, and it says quickly. Some Bibles might say soon, but it's literally the word tache, which is soon, not soon, but quickly. With haste, he was going to go. So he came into Jerusalem, but he didn't stay long. He was going back to Caesarea. Now, one of the reasons of that is that Caesarea, it was a little Rome. And being such an important individual, he would have had the best of life that the finest things could have offered him. So having come to Jerusalem, probably sent there for some business purpose from the Roman Empire, some administrative purpose, he did his job there, and now he couldn't wait to get back to Caesarea. So he said, I'm about quickly, at once, to go. Look at verse 5. Therefore, the ones who are able, who are among you, Festus spoke, let him go down with, meaning with me, let him go together. And it says, and if there is something wrong with this man, it says, let them accuse him. So he says, if you want a trial, you got to send those who are able with me and let them accuse him at Caesarea. What he's saying is this, that there is going to be a Roman trial. Now, this is very clear, and this bodes well for Paul, because the Roman law was very clear, and Paul wanted it to be such for him to have the benefits of that type of judicial system, because he was so well acquainted with the corruption of the Sanhedrin. And remember something, many of the priests, and it's important that we hear this and remember this, many of the priests stopped serving in Jerusalem, stopped going up there for the festivals because of the corruption of the city towards the end of the Second Temple period. And this is what brought about the destruction of the temple, the corruption, the lack of justice. And Messiah's crucifixion is an excellent example of this. When they did not follow the protocol of the Sanhedrin, and they did what was unthinkable for the Sanhedrin to do, and that is to turn over a Jewish individual for Roman judgment. That was not done, because the Romans, they might put someone to death, and according to biblical law, a Jewish person, if he was guilty, he had to die in a certain way. So all of this shows the corruption of the Jewish leadership at this time. Look again what he says. He says, therefore, those who are able among you, and he's speaking, he says, let them go with me is the intent. And if there's something wrong with this man, let them accuse him or charge him. Verse 6. And spending some time with them, and it says many days or 10. Now, I realize in some other manuscripts it says 8 or 10 days, but in the Masoretic text it says that he spent more than 10 days. Now, the purpose of this is very clear. The purpose is that maybe they might have done something in order to cause Festus to do something differently. But he was there for 10 days, and then it says, he went down into Caesarea. And on the next day, he sat upon the bema, on the judgment seat, and he commanded that Paul be brought. So here again, you have to ask yourself, why did he delay? Why did he pause? And that's exactly what that Greek word means. He kind of delayed for 10 days. Even though he says, I'm going to go quickly, he waited 10 days. And when nothing happened, what did he decide to do? He went up into Caesarea. We would say properly, he went down from Jerusalem to Caesarea. And notice what he did. It says, on the next day, as he sat upon the judgment seat, he commanded that Paul be brought forward. And verse 7, we read here, and Paul arriving, it's in the third person singular. And when he arrived, but this is Paul, notice what happened. It says, and the ones from Jerusalem who had come down from Jerusalem of the Judeans. So the Judeans from Jerusalem who had come down, meaning come down from Jerusalem to Caesarea. What did they do? Look at the middle of verse 7. Many and weighty accusations were brought against Paul. Now, this is important because they brought many charges and also weighty. Now, this could be understood in two ways. That they could be very thoroughly, very specific, or it could be very serious ones. So many that's easy to understand. The second word can have two implications, that they were very serious charges, or it could be understood that they were very specific and detailed in their accusations against Paul. They were prepared and they made serious and many charges against him. Now, Paul's going to do something, and that is he is going to exploit the fact that they have overcharged him. All these things that they're saying, there's no evidence. We'll see that in a moment. There's no evidence for these accusations. Paul knows it, and what are they doing? Well, they're doing the same thing that they did against Yeshua. They try to give the appearance that this one, whether it's Yeshua or Paul, that he is dangerous, that he has committed horrible crimes, and they want a serious punishment placed upon him. So many and weighty charges they brought against Paul. But notice the end of verse 7. It says, but they were not able to prove. That is, literally, they were not able to show. They couldn't show any evidence, and that's the implication for these charges. They were just hoping that he would hear and on the fact that they were making them. Who? The high priests and the most influential leaders in Judah, specifically Jerusalem. That they would make these accusations unfounded, no evidence, although they pinpointed these charges. And sometimes when you say all of these specific things trying to build up a case, but you have no evidence, it falls apart. And notice what happens immediately thereafter. Verse 8. They showed no evidence. They just made these detailed and many charges. It says, and Paul, literally it's the pronoun again, and he answering that not against the law of the Judeans. Now, this is important because it doesn't say against the law of Moses. They weren't bringing charges against some Torah violation. This is very important that the reader understand this. The ones who were doing this were called the Judeans. Why is that important? Because the Judeans don't represent the Jewish people in general. That's not what that term is relating. Many times it's translated just as the Jews, meaning the Jewish people. But it should not be understood this way. It's speaking about a particular sect of Judaism. Those who followed not Torat Moshe, the law of Moses, but those who followed, and this is what's important, the tradition of the elders. What we would say today, the oral law. And what Paul is saying is that he has not broken any of those rules either. Very important that we see what he says. That not against the law of the Judeans, not against the temple, meaning what one of their accusations was having to do with something that he did in bringing Gentiles, unclean individuals, into the temple area. Now, understand what I said and what I did not intend to say. I am not saying, and it was not my intent to say, that Gentiles in and of themselves are unclean. We've already dealt with that when we looked at Acts chapter 10. That's not the right perspective from the scripture. When I say Gentiles, my implication is this: those who would not have followed the religious requirements for making oneself pure in entering into that area. There was an assumption made that because of who they were not properly prepared. Now, two things were wrong. We talked about this. They were not Gentiles. They were Jews from the diaspora. And Paul did prepare them properly. So that's why he says here that there was neither any violations against the temple. And finally he concludes, nor he says, against Caesar. So not against the traditional law of Judaism, not against any of the requirements of the temple, and not against Roman law, against Caesar, he says, have I sinned something? He says, there's nothing that I've done in these three areas. And furthermore, although they have made these accusations again, and this can't be overemphasized, they have no evidence. They just have indictments, but they don't have any evidence to support these charges, these accusations that they've made against him. Look now to verse 9. But, and this is an important word, this shows in contrast to this. See, Festus, he knows the reality of the situation, but now he's going to do something in contrast with what he should have done. The answer that he should have done is simply saying, end of trial. Release Paul. There was charges that could not be supported. And Paul says, against none of these things they have any proof. But in light of that, and against that, it says, but Festus, in order to what? Desiring, what it says is, desiring to do the Judeans a favor, answered Paul and said, do you want to go up to Jerusalem in order that there, concerning these things, that you be judged by me? Now, something's very odd, and this should jump up off the pages, because why? Why would Paul want to do this in Jerusalem? Now, there's an answer here. You see, Festus, he wants some benefit. Many scholars feel he's seeking a bribe. He's willing to do favors, and he says something here that makes no sense. I mean, where is Festus? Well, if we go back, look if you would carefully to verse 6. It says here, and on the next day he sat upon the judgment seat. Well, why would he be sitting upon the judgment seat? The answer is very clear. To render judgment. He had the person, the defendant, the one who was charged, brought before him. He had the accusations, the bill of indictments read. But there was no evidence to support it. And Paul testified against none of these things. Not against the law of the Judeans, not against the temple law, and not against anything concerning Roman law has he sinned against. He's innocent. So what should be done? No evidence. He should be released. But Festus didn't do that. In contrast, and that's why that word is so important, in contrast, what did Festus say? Do you want to go up to Jerusalem in order that I should judge concerning these things you there? And obviously, it makes no sense. He's at a court. He says, you want me to do it in Jerusalem? Now, in actuality, what he's doing is threatening Paul. He's seeking, as some scholars point out, for some favor, some payment. And why do I say that? Because, first of all, he should judge him there. But see, he knows something. He knows that Paul is very much aware that how he was transferred from Jerusalem to Caesarea was under the highest security. We read this, we studied this, that there were numerous soldiers surrounding Paul in order to escort him and ensure his safety because of this plot to put him to death. Well, they took that precaution, sending him there, but Paul can't be sure that if he goes back, what's going to happen? That same safety is placed upon him, that's afforded to him. Festus knows this. These individuals are not foolish. They're very bright individuals. So he's threatening Paul. He says, Paul, do you want me to send you back to Jerusalem? The implication is you may die on the way. But what does Paul do? He uses his Roman citizenship. Why do I say that? Look, if you would, to verse 10. But, that is that same word, in contrast to this, against what Festus was planning, Paul said, upon the judgment seat of Caesar I stand. Now, he says this for two purposes. One is to say, hey, I understand what you're doing. I understand that right now I am at the judgment seat. Why don't you give, based upon this trial, a verdict? Why don't you send me free? See, Paul understands this man's corruption. So he says here, I am currently standing upon the judgment seat of Caesar, where it is necessary for me to be judged. Why does he say that? Well, the answer is very simple. Because he's a Roman citizen. It is his right to be judged in a Roman court. So it says it's necessary, and this word is a very strong one. It means it's absolutely a must. It has to be. I have this perfect right that you make judgment concerning me. But what happens? Well, look at the middle of verse 10. He says, and to the Jews, none of this, meaning this unrighteousness that they claim, he says, none of this also you know very well. So none of these things, this unrighteousness that they're charging me with, these violations, he says, you know very well. And it's very important that we see the words that are used here. First of all, this expression, it's one word in the Greek for very well. See, what Paul is doing is he's really pointing out the corruption and the deceit of Festus. He says, you know what the Jews are charging me of, these Judeans. He says, you know of this unrighteousness. You know very well. And he uses the word, not the normal one, to know something. It's a word to know something upon. Now that may sound odd to us, but here's what Paul's saying. It's something that you have come to know, that you recognize. And the implication is that it's built upon something. This is not something that you think, that you know simply because you feel it, you think it, but rather it's something that you have arrived at based upon something. There's a prefix that's before this normal word for knowing, which means to know something based upon something. So Paul says, you know this thing very well. You know, this is not a surprise to you. This is not unfamiliar to you. You know the reality of the situation. Look now to verse 11. Paul says something very strong here. He says, for if, and he talks about this construction on one hand and the other. He says, you know, and this is one situation, for if I was, and he uses the word, an offender, if I was guilty, it's a word for being unrighteous. So he says, for if I was unrighteous and worthy of death, I had practiced something, I had done something, he says, I would not refuse to die. So he said, I want a righteous judgment. I am willing to suffer the consequences of my actions. I'm not looking for favor. I'm not looking for something that I don't deserve. I'm willing, if I have violated any of the law, whether it's against the law of my people or the law of Caesar, I wouldn't refuse to die if I was guilty of this. Look again. For if I was unrighteous and worthy of death, had practiced something, I would not refuse to die. But, he says, these things being, there is nothing that they can accuse me. Based upon, and what he's saying is this, based upon, and remember where he is. Festus is at the judgment seat. He's in court. And he's saying, Your Honor, I'm willing to suffer the consequences of these charges. But the reality is, there's no evidence being offered to support these charges. And furthermore, these charges I am not guilty of. Not just there's no evidence, but I have done nothing of these accusations against me. And no man, he goes on, look at the end of verse 11. He says, and no man is able to do something, to deliver me to them. Now, what's he saying? He's saying, you really don't have the authority to deliver me, no one does, to them, to send me back to Jerusalem. Why is that? Because of his Roman citizenship. He says, you and I both know, now this shows something. Paul knows not only Torah law very well, but he also knows Roman law. And I think this has a strong message to us, that we need to be broad in our understanding of things. We need to know how the enemy works, and not only how God works, in order that we can spot him, in order that we can discern his unrighteous ways. And Paul, he understands Roman law. And he says, no man is able to deliver me to them. What does he do? He says, I appeal, literally, I call upon Caesar. Now, that was a legal action. He's saying, I want Caesar's judgment in this. Meaning simply, I want to go not just here in a branch of Caesar's court, but I want to go before Caesar himself, before this Roman center of judgment all the way back to Rome. And that's what he's asking for. And notice Festus' response. See, when someone would do that, I mean, he would only, this is like appealing to the Supreme Court in many countries. We have a Supreme Court here in Israel, and of course in other countries as well. And it's going there, and the supposition is this: I want the best judge. I want the court that is the most equipped to handle this case. I'm not afraid of justice. I'm not afraid of what the Roman law, the best application of it, would bring about. And Festus says something because Paul has this right. Notice verse 12. Then Festus, speaking together, meaning he took counsel with others, and among those in the council, and he answered. He says, to Caesar it's been appealed, unto Caesar you shall go. And this sets Paul on this journey to Rome. And God is going to use that, as we know, that he might take that message of the gospel. And we need to realize something else. You know, when Paul was saved on that road to Damascus, and when he went into the city, remember Ananias? He prophesied, and he says, not just among people and nations, but to kings and ruler you will testify. And that's what's going to end up happening to Paul. He is going to have his case go before Rome, the most influential place in secular thinking at this time of the world. And going there, he can impact the world. So God's using these accusations, false accusations, for a fulfillment of God's will and call for the life of Paul. And that's why we need to learn something. Do not fear those who are against you. I mean, isn't that what we learn when we studied Psalm 11 tonight and read that God, He sees all, He has discernment, and in the right time, He will move. And whatever anyone does against you, God, this sovereign, this almighty God, He is able to use it in order that your life might fulfill His purposes. And that's why when there's attacks, when there's false accusations against us, you don't have to fret and wring your hands and be all upset and say, oh me, oh my, what's going on here? Realize something, that the true judge does indeed sit upon the throne. And God will use it. God will move in that situation according to His goodness, according to His perfect way. And in the midst of it, we are going to be doing what God calls us to do. We're going to be faithful despite what goes on around us and to us. Because our objective is to be faithful. You know, if everything was going easy, if there was no opposition, if everything was just fine and wonderful, it'd be really easy to be faithful and obedient. But in the midst of attacks, unjust attacks, the enemy going after us, well, that's when your faithfulness and your obedience and your trust and your confidence in the Lord, it is manifested the strongest. So again, don't worry. Don't fret. Don't fall to pieces when the enemy moves against you. God is going to use it for greater things that you could ever imagine. Paul's a great example of that, and my hope and my prayer is that you and me as well, that we will be examples of God's faithfulness, that we will demonstrate our trust in Him in those difficult times when we fall under false accusations. Well, I'll close with that. Until next week, may God richly bless you. Shalom from Israel.
Well, we hope you will benefit from today's message and share it with others. Please plan to join us each week at this time and on this channel for our broadcast of LoveIsrael.org. Again, to find out more about us, please visit our website, LoveIsrael.org. There you will find articles and numerous other lectures by Baruch. These teachings are in video form. You may download them or watch them in streaming video. Until next week, may the Lord bless you in our Messiah Yeshua, that is Jesus, as you walk with Him. Shalom from Israel.